The basketball bounced one last time against the gym wall before 16-year-old Diego caught it and tucked it under his arm. Practice had run late again, but he didn't mind. Coach Peterson had been working them hard for the upcoming tournament, and Diego loved every minute of it. The sound of squeaking sneakers and echoing voices faded behind him as he pushed through the heavy doors of Lincoln High School. The March evening air felt crisp against his sweaty face. Diego pulled his hoodie over his head and started the familiar walk home through the Riverside neighborhood. It was the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before, past the corner store where Mr. Kim always waved from behind the counter, down Oak Street with its row of small houses, and then 3 more blocks to his apartment building. Diego's backpack felt heavier than usual tonight. He had a math test tomorrow, and Mrs. Thompson's history essay was due on Friday. But right now, all he could think about was the leftover pizza his mom had promised to save for him. His stomach growled just thinking about it. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on as he turned onto Pine Avenue. This was always the quietest part of his walk. Most people were inside having dinner or watching TV. Diego liked this peaceful stretch. It gave him time to think about the game plays Coach had shown them, or sometimes just to enjoy the silence after a noisy day at school. That's when he noticed the police car. It was moving slowly behind him, almost like it was following. Diego glanced over his shoulder and saw 2 officers inside. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were common in this neighborhood. Sometimes they just drove around to make sure everything was okay. But when Diego turned the corner onto Maple Street, the car turned too. And when he crossed to the other side of the street, the car did the same thing. Now his heart started beating a little faster. He picked up his pace but tried to act normal. Maybe they were just going in the same direction he was. The red and blue lights started flashing just as Diego reached the middle of the block. "Stop right there," a voice called out through a loudspeaker. "Turn around slowly and keep your hands where we can see them." Diego's mouth went dry. He stopped walking and slowly turned around, his basketball still tucked under one arm and his backpack hanging from his shoulder. The police car had pulled up to the curb and both officers were getting out. One was tall and heavyset with graying hair. The other was younger and shorter with nervous energy that made him move quickly. "What's going on, officers?" Diego asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His father had taught him to always be respectful and calm when talking to police. "We're looking for someone who matches your description," the older officer said, walking closer. His name tag read Johnson. "There was a break-in reported about an hour ago. Young male, dark hoodie carrying a backpack." Diego looked down at his clothes. He was wearing a dark blue hoodie and carrying his school backpack. He could see how that might match a description, but he'd been at basketball practice for the past 2 hours. "I understand the confusion, sir," Diego said politely, "but I've been at school this whole time. I just finished basketball practice at Lincoln High. I can show you my student ID if that helps." The younger officer, whose badge said Martinez, moved to Diego's side. "Just put the ball down and slowly take off your backpack," he said. Diego did as he was told, placing his basketball on the sidewalk and carefully sliding his backpack off his shoulders. "Officers, I live just 3 blocks from here. My name is Diego Vasquez and my student ID is in my wallet." "We'll check that in a minute," Officer Johnson said. "Right now we need you to put your hands behind your back." "Why?" Diego asked, confusion clear in his voice. "I haven't done anything wrong. I told you I was at school." "Don't argue with us, kid," Martinez snapped. "Just do what we're telling you to do." Diego felt his heart racing, but he slowly put his hands behind his back. He could hear doors opening in the houses nearby. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down had come out onto her porch. Mr. and Mrs. Kim from the apartment building across the street were standing by their front gate, watching. The handcuffs felt cold and tight around Diego's wrists. He'd never been handcuffed before. The metal pinched his skin and he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. "This is a mistake," Diego said, his voice starting to shake. "Please just look at my ID, call the school. Coach Peterson is probably still there. He can tell you I was at practice." Officer Johnson opened Diego's backpack and started pulling things out. His math textbook, his notebook, a water bottle, his gym clothes from practice that still smelled like sweat. Nothing that looked like stolen property, just normal school stuff. "Where do you live exactly?" Martinez asked. 247 Cedar Avenue, apartment 3B. Diego answered immediately. "It's the red brick building 3 blocks down." My mom's name is Rosa Vasquez and my dad is Captain Antonio Vasquez. He works for the police department. Both officers looked at each other when Diego mentioned his father, but Johnson just shook his head. Sure he is, kid. And I'm the mayor. More neighbors had come outside now. Diego could see people holding up their phones, probably recording what was happening. He felt embarrassed and scared. What if his friends from school saw this? What if it ended up on social media? Please, Diego said again. Just call my dad. His number is in my phone. Or call the school. This is all a big misunderstanding. But Officer Martinez was already talking into his radio. We need a transport unit to Pine and Maple, he said. We've got a possible suspect in custody. Diego's legs felt weak. Transport unit? They were really going to arrest him? For what, walking home from school? Mrs. Patterson walked closer from her porch. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. Excuse me, officers, she called out. That's Diego. He lives right down the street with his family. I've known him since he was little. He's a good kid. Ma'am, please step back, Johnson said firmly. This is police business. But you've got the wrong person, Mrs. Patterson insisted. Diego walks past my house every day after school. He always waves and says hello. He's never been in any trouble. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again, Martinez said, his hand moving toward his belt. Step back or we'll have to arrest you for interfering with a police investigation. Mrs. Patterson's eyes went wide, and she took several steps backward. Diego felt even worse now. These officers were threatening to arrest an old lady just for trying to help him. Officers, please, Diego said one more time. I understand you're just doing your job, but I promise you I'm not the person you're looking for. I was at basketball practice. Check my phone for the time I texted my mom that practice was running late. Check my gym clothes. They're still damp with sweat. But neither officer seemed to be listening anymore. They were both looking down the street at something. Diego turned his head and saw another police car approaching with its lights flashing. His heart sank. Instead of checking his story or looking at his ID, they were calling for backup. This was getting worse by the minute. All Diego wanted was to go home, eat his pizza, and study for his math test. Instead, he was standing on the sidewalk in handcuffs while his neighbors watched and recorded. The second police car pulled up just as Diego heard his phone buzzing in his backpack. Someone was calling him. But the officers had already sealed his backpack and put it in their car. Diego couldn't help but wonder who was trying to reach him. Maybe it was his mom, wondering why he was late getting home from practice. Maybe it was his little sister Luna, calling to ask if he could help her with homework. What he didn't know was that his whole world was about to change in ways he could never imagine. The backup officers who stepped out of the second patrol car looked just as serious as the first two. Diego watched as they huddled together, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing in his direction. He could catch bits and pieces of their conversation. Matches the description, one of them said. Found him walking away from the area, said another. Kids being uncooperative, Officer Martinez added, which made Diego's stomach drop. Uncooperative? All he'd done was try to explain who he was and where he'd been. Diego looked around at the growing crowd of neighbors. More people had come outside, drawn by the flashing lights and commotion. He recognized most of them. There was Mr. Chen from the apartment next to his building, holding his little daughter's hand. Mrs. Rodriguez from the house with the flower garden was standing on her porch, shaking her head. Even old Mr. Thompson, who rarely left his house, was peering out from behind his curtains. These were people who had known Diego his whole life. They'd watched him grow up, seen him walk to school every morning and come home every afternoon. Some of them had even been to his birthday parties when he was younger. But now they were watching him get arrested, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Officers, Mrs. Rodriguez called out, walking closer. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think there's been a mistake. That's Diego Vasquez. His family lives in building 1247. I've known them for years. His father works in law enforcement. Officer Johnson turned toward her with an annoyed expression. Ma'am, like I told the other lady, you need to step back. This is an active investigation. But I'm telling you, you have the wrong person, Mrs. Rodriguez insisted. Diego is an honor student. He plays basketball. He helps his neighbors carry groceries. This doesn't make any sense. Ma'am, are you a witness to the crime we're investigating? Martinez asked sarcastically. Well, no, but then you don't know what you're talking about. Martinez cut her off. Now please move back before we have to arrest you for obstruction. Diego felt sick watching this. These officers were threatening to arrest his neighbors just for trying to help him. Mrs. Rodriguez looked hurt and confused as she stepped back toward her porch. From his position in handcuffs, Diego could see more people gathering. Some were taking pictures and videos with their phones. A few were calling other neighbors to come outside. He heard someone say they were calling the local news station. Please, officers, Diego tried again. My phone has my dad's contact information. He's Captain Antonio Vasquez with the department. Just call him. This whole thing can be cleared up in 2 minutes. Kid, we've heard every story in the book, Johnson said dismissively. Everyone's dad is a cop when they get arrested. Everyone's uncle is the mayor. Everyone was just minding their own business. But it's true, Diego said, his voice getting stronger despite his fear. Look in my wallet. I have a family photo. My dad is wearing his uniform in it. Check my emergency contact information at school. Please, I'm begging you to just make one phone call. One of the backup officers walked over to Johnson and whispered something in his ear. Johnson nodded and then spoke into his radio. We're going to need a transport vehicle, he said. We've got a juvenile suspect and we want to take him to the station for questioning. Diego's heart nearly stopped. They were really going to arrest him and take him to jail? For walking home from basketball practice? What crime am I being charged with? Diego asked, trying to remember everything his father had taught him about his rights. Breaking and entering, Martinez said. And resisting arrest. Resisting arrest? Diego's voice cracked. I put my hands behind my back when you told me to. I answered all your questions. I haven't resisted anything. You kept arguing with us instead of cooperating, Martinez replied. Diego couldn't believe what he was hearing. Asking questions and trying to prove his innocence was now considered resisting arrest? Meanwhile, 3 stories up in apartment 3B on Cedar Avenue, Diego's 12-year-old sister Luna was doing her homework at the kitchen table when she heard the sirens. Living in the city, sirens weren't unusual, but these sounded close. Really close. Luna walked to the window and looked down toward the street where the sirens seemed to be coming from. She could see flashing red and blue lights a few blocks away, right around where Diego usually walked home from practice. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. Diego was always home by now. He'd been late before, but he always texted their mom when practice ran over. And he always texted Luna when he was on his way home, asking if she needed anything from the corner store. Luna grabbed her phone and called Diego's number. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. She tried again with the same result. Now she was really worried. She looked out the window again and noticed that the crowd of people seemed to be getting bigger. More police cars had arrived. Something was definitely wrong. Luna knew she should probably wait for her mom to come home from work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Diego was in trouble. She grabbed the landline phone and dialed the number she'd memorized years ago, her dad's direct line at the police station. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Captain Vasquez's office, this is Sergeant Williams. Hi, Sergeant Williams, this is Luna, Captain Vasquez's daughter. Is my dad available? It's kind of urgent. I'm sorry, Luna, but your dad is in a very important meeting right now. The kind where he can't be interrupted unless it's a real emergency. Can I take a message? Luna hesitated. Was this a real emergency? She didn't know for sure that Diego was in trouble. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Well, Diego isn't home yet from basketball practice, and there are police cars and sirens near where he usually walks. I tried calling him, but he's not answering his phone. I'm sure he's fine, honey, Sergeant Williams said kindly. Maybe practice ran really late. Or maybe he stopped at a friend's house. Why don't you try calling your mom at work? Okay, Luna said, but she didn't feel better. If my dad's meeting ends soon, can you tell him I called? Of course. Don't worry, Luna. Diego's a smart kid. I'm sure he's fine, but Diego wasn't fine. 2 miles away, he was still standing in handcuffs while the officers waited for the transport van. The crowd of neighbors had grown to almost 20 people. Some were getting angry, demanding to know why the police were arresting a kid who obviously lived in the neighborhood. This is harassment, Mr. Chen called out. That boy has never caused any trouble in this neighborhood. Everyone needs to disperse immediately, one of the backup officers announced through a megaphone. If you don't leave the area, you will be arrested for unlawful assembly. The threat worked. Slowly, reluctantly, people started moving back toward their homes, but many stayed on their porches and in their doorways, still watching, still recording. Diego felt more alone than ever. His wrists were starting to hurt from the handcuffs. His legs were tired from standing in one position for so long. His stomach was empty and growling, and worst of all, he could see the disappointment and fear in his neighbors' eyes as they looked at him. 2 blocks away at Lincoln High School, Coach Peterson was just finishing up his paperwork in his office. The janitorial staff had already started cleaning the gym and most of the school was empty. He was about to lock up and head home when his phone rang. "Hello, this is Coach Peterson. Coach, this is Rosa Vasquez, Diego's mom. I'm sorry to bother you, but Diego isn't home yet. Did practice run late today?" Coach Peterson looked at his watch. Practice had ended over an hour ago. "No, Mrs. Vasquez, we finished right on time today. Diego left with all the other boys around 6:30. He seemed fine. Said he was looking forward to going home for dinner." Rosa felt her heart skip a beat. "Are you sure? He's not still there?" "I'm positive. The school is empty except for me and the cleaning crew. Is everything okay? I don't know," Rosa said, her voice starting to shake. "He's not answering his phone, and he's never this late without calling." Coach Peterson felt a knot forming in his stomach. Diego was one of his most responsible players. The kid was never in trouble, never missed practice, and always let people know where he was. "Mrs. Vasquez, have you tried calling Captain Vasquez? He's in some big meeting at work. They said he couldn't be disturbed unless it was a real emergency." "Maybe it's time to make it a real emergency," Coach Peterson said gently. Back on Maple Street, the transport van finally arrived. Diego watched as the rear doors opened and an officer stepped out. This was really happening. They were really going to put him in the back of that van and take him to jail. "Officers, please," Diego tried one last time. "Before you put me in that van, just look at my student ID. Just call the school. Just call my dad, please, I'm begging you." But Officer Johnson was already opening the van door. "Get in," he said. As Diego was led toward the van, he noticed something that gave him a tiny bit of hope. Mrs. Patterson was standing on her porch talking rapidly into her phone. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but her voice sounded urgent and determined. What Diego didn't know was that Mrs. Patterson was calling every contact she had in the police department, trying to reach someone who knew Captain Vasquez. She'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that sometimes the only way to fix a wrong was to go straight to the top. And at that very moment, 2 miles away at police headquarters, Captain Antonio Vasquez was about to receive the most important promotion of his career. But he was also about to discover that being at the top meant that the hardest decisions were yet to come. The conference room at police headquarters had been buzzing with quiet conversations for the past hour. Captain Antonio Vasquez sat at the long mahogany table, straightening his tie for the 3rd time. He'd been called to this meeting without much explanation, just that the mayor, the city council, and the police commissioner needed to speak with him urgently. Around the table sat the most powerful people in the city. Mayor Patricia Chen sat at the head, shuffling through a stack of papers. Police Commissioner Robert Davies was reviewing what looked like personnel files. The 5 city council members whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in Antonio's direction with expressions he couldn't quite read. Antonio had been with the police department for 22 years. He'd started as a beat cop in the toughest neighborhoods, worked his way up through detective work, and spent the last 8 years as a captain. But he'd never been in a room quite like this one. "Captain Vasquez," Mayor Chen finally began, "thank you for joining us on such short notice. I know you're probably wondering why you're here." "Yes, ma'am," Antonio replied, keeping his voice steady despite the nervous energy building in his chest. "We've been reviewing your record," Commissioner Davies said, opening one of the files in front of him. 22 years of service. Commendations for bravery. Community outreach awards. You developed that youth mentorship program that reduced crime in the East Side District by 30%. Antonio nodded but stayed quiet. He'd learned long ago that sometimes it was better to listen than to talk in meetings like this. "Your officers have the highest community satisfaction ratings in the department," Councilmember Thompson added. "Crime rates in your district have dropped consistently for the past 5 years, and your approach to de-escalation training has become a model for other departments across the state. We've also noticed," Mayor Chen continued, "that you've never had a single excessive force complaint filed against you or any officer under your command. In 22 years, that's almost unheard of." Antonio felt a small surge of pride. Those statistics weren't accidents. He'd worked hard to build trust between his officers and the communities they served. He'd implemented new training programs, spent countless hours doing community outreach, and always tried to lead by example. "Captain," Commissioner Davies said, leaning forward in his chair, "Chief Williams announced his retirement this morning. After 30 years of service, he's decided it's time to step down." Antonio's heart skipped a beat. Chief Williams had been talking about retirement for months, but everyone thought he'd wait until the end of the year. If the chief was stepping down now, that meant the department would need new leadership immediately. "We've spent the last 6 hours discussing who should replace him," Mayor Chen said. "We reviewed the qualifications of every captain and deputy chief in the department. We looked at education, experience, community relations, and leadership skills." Councilmember Rodriguez opened another folder. "We also considered the current climate in our city and across the country. People are demanding change in how police departments operate. They want leaders who understand that law enforcement isn't just about arrests and citations. It's about building relationships and serving the community." The decision was unanimous, Mayor Chen announced. "Captain Vasquez, we would like to offer you the position of Chief of Police." The words hit Antonio like a wave. Chief of Police. He'd dreamed about this possibility for years, but he'd never imagined it would happen so soon or so suddenly. I'm honored," Antonio managed to say. "Truly honored. But this is a big decision. Can I have some time to think about it?" Commissioner Davies smiled. "Actually, Captain, we need an answer today. Chief Williams's retirement is effective immediately. The city needs leadership, and we need it now." Antonio's mind raced. This was everything he'd worked toward his entire career, the chance to implement real change, to lead a department, to make a difference on a citywide scale. But it also meant enormous responsibility and pressure. "What would be expected of me?" he asked. "Continue the work you've already been doing," Councilmember Johnson replied. "But on a larger scale, we want you to bring your community-focused approach to the entire department, modernize training programs, improve community relations, show the city that police can be both effective and compassionate." "We're facing some challenges," Mayor Chen admitted. "Public trust in law enforcement is at a low point nationally. We've had some incidents in other districts that have strained community relations. We need a leader who can bridge that gap." Antonio thought about his own experiences growing up in this city. He remembered being a teenager and feeling nervous around police officers, even though he'd never been in trouble. He remembered how that changed when he met Officer Patricia Gonzalez, a community liaison who took the time to get to know the kids in his neighborhood. She'd been the reason he decided to become a police officer himself. "If I accept," Antonio said, "I'd want to implement some significant changes. Enhanced de-escalation training for all officers, mandatory community service hours, regular town halls where citizens can speak directly with police leadership, body cameras for every officer, and a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate complaints." The room was quiet for a moment. Antonio wondered if he'd overplayed his hand. Then Mayor Chen smiled. "Captain, those are exactly the kinds of changes we were hoping you'd propose. Does that mean you accept the position?" Commissioner Davies asked. Antonio took a deep breath. He thought about Rosa and the kids. This promotion would mean longer hours, more stress, and intense scrutiny of everything he did. But it also meant the chance to create the kind of police department he'd always dreamed of working for. "Yes," he said firmly, "I accept." The room erupted in handshakes and congratulations. Someone opened a bottle of champagne that had been waiting in a small refrigerator. Photos were taken for the press release. Mayor Chen's assistant was already on the phone with local news stations. "We'd like to announce this immediately," Mayor Chen said. "Can you stay for a press conference?" "Of course," Antonio replied, though he was still trying to process everything that had just happened. 30 minutes later, Antonio stood behind a podium in the main lobby of City Hall, facing a room full of reporters and camera crews. The mayor had just finished introducing him as the city's new chief of police. Flashbulbs were going off and reporters were shouting questions. "Chief Vasquez," called out a reporter from Channel 7 News. "What's your first priority in this new role?" "Building trust between the police department and the communities we serve," Antonio answered confidently. "Too often there's an us versus them mentality. I want to change that. Police officers should be seen as neighbors and helpers, not as an occupying force." "What about crime rates?" asked a reporter from the local newspaper. Some people worry that community-focused policing might mean less effective law enforcement. I disagree completely, Antonio replied. In my experience, when communities trust their police, they're more willing to report crimes, serve as witnesses, and work with us to solve problems before they become bigger issues. Community policing isn't soft on crime, it's smart policing. Chief Vasquez, another reporter called out, "You're taking over at a time when police departments across the country are facing intense scrutiny. How do you plan to address concerns about police accountability? Transparency and accountability are essential," Antonio said. "Every officer in this department will wear a body camera. We'll have regular community meetings where citizens can ask questions and voice concerns. And we'll have an independent civilian oversight board to investigate any complaints against officers." The questions continued for 20 more minutes. Antonio felt confident and energized. This was his chance to make a real difference, to show the city and the country that police departments could evolve and improve. As the press conference wrapped up, Antonio's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, focusing on the final questions from reporters. Then it buzzed again, and again. When he finally had a moment to check his phone, he saw 5 missed calls from Luna, 3 from Rosa, and 2 from numbers he didn't recognize. There were also several text messages, all marked urgent. The most recent text was from Sergeant Williams. "Chief, you need to call me immediately. There's a situation involving Diego." Antonio's blood went cold. He excused himself from the group of congratulatory officials and stepped into a quiet hallway to call Sergeant Williams back. "Sergeant, what's going on with Diego?" "Sir, I'm not entirely sure of all the details, but I've been getting calls from people in the Riverside neighborhood. Apparently, Diego was detained by some officers earlier this evening. I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding." Antonio felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Detained? For what?" "From what I understand, there was a break-in reported, and Diego apparently matched some kind of description." "But Chief, the people calling me say he was just walking home from school." "Where is he now?" Antonio demanded, already heading toward the exit. "I believe they transported him to the Riverside station." "Sir, I tried to get more information, but the officers involved aren't from our district." Antonio was already in his car, starting the engine. "I'm on my way there now." As he drove through the city streets with his emergency lights flashing, Antonio's mind raced. Less than an hour ago, he'd been celebrating the biggest promotion of his career, talking to reporters about trust and accountability and community policing. Now his own son was apparently caught up in exactly the kind of situation he'd spent his career trying to prevent. The irony wasn't lost on him. On the same day, he'd been chosen to lead the police department into a new era of community relations. His own family was experiencing firsthand how those relations could go wrong. Antonio pressed harder on the accelerator. Whatever was happening, whatever misunderstanding had occurred, he was going to fix it. And then he was going to make sure it never happened to any other family in his city again. Behind him, the lights of City Hall grew smaller in his rearview mirror. The celebration was over. Now the real work was about to begin. Antonio's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he raced through the streets toward the Riverside district. The police radio in his car crackled with routine calls and traffic stops, but all he could think about was Diego. His mind kept replaying Sergeant Williams' words. Detained. Misunderstanding. Transported to the station. The drive to the Riverside station normally took 25 minutes. Antonio made it in 12. He pulled into the parking lot still wearing his dress uniform from the press conference. The gold buttons and pressed fabric that had made him look so official an hour ago now felt like a costume. Right now, he wasn't Chief Antonio Vasquez. He was just a father trying to find his son. Inside the station, the desk sergeant looked up with surprise. "Captain Vasquez?" Congratulations on the promotion, sir. I just saw you on the news. What brings you down here?" "I need to know if you have my son Diego Vasquez in custody," Antonio said, trying to keep his voice professional despite the panic building in his chest. The desk sergeant's face went pale. "Your son? Let me check the intake log." Antonio watched the sergeant's fingers move across the computer keyboard, each second feeling like an eternity. Through the glass doors, he could see into the main hallway of the station. Officers were walking back and forth handling their regular duties, completely unaware of the personal crisis unfolding at the front desk. "Yes, sir," the sergeant said quietly. Diego Vasquez, age 16, brought in about 30 minutes ago. He's in holding room 3. What's he charged with? Antonio asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. Breaking and entering and resisting arrest. Antonio felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Diego had never been in trouble in his life. The kid was an honor student, a varsity athlete, a volunteer at the community center. The idea that he would break into someone's house was absurd. And resisting arrest? Diego knew better than that. Antonio had taught him how to interact with police since he was old enough to understand. "I need to see him," Antonio said. "Of course, sir. Right this way." As they walked down the hallway, Antonio's mind raced with questions. Who were the arresting officers? What evidence did they have? How had this happened? They stopped in front of a heavy metal door with a small window. Through the glass, Antonio could see Diego sitting at a metal table, still in his basketball clothes. His hands were folded in front of him and his shoulders were slumped in a way that made him look smaller and younger than his 16 years. "Has he been processed yet?" Antonio asked. "They were just about to start fingerprinting when you arrived," the desk sergeant replied. Antonio took a deep breath and opened the door. Diego looked up and the relief on his face was immediate and overwhelming. "Dad." Diego stood up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "I knew you'd come. I tried to tell them who you were, but they wouldn't listen." Antonio crossed the room in 2 quick steps and pulled his son into a hug. Diego felt smaller than usual in his arms, and Antonio could feel him shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" Antonio asked, pulling back to look at Diego's face. "Did anyone hurt you?" "No, they didn't hurt me. But Dad, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home from practice and they said I matched some description. They wouldn't even look at my student ID." Before Antonio could respond, the door opened behind them. 2 officers walked in, and Antonio immediately recognized the type. He'd worked with hundreds of cops over the years, and he could read their body language like a book. These 2 were defensive, maybe a little nervous, but still convinced they'd done the right thing. "Captain Vasquez?" the older officer said, extending his hand. "I'm Officer Johnson, and this is Officer Martinez. We're the arresting officers." Antonio shook their hands but kept his expression neutral. "Officers, can you walk me through what happened tonight?" "We received a call about a break-in on Oak Street," Johnson explained. "Young male, dark clothing, carrying a backpack. When we spotted your son walking in the area, he matched the description perfectly." "Did you ask him where he'd been?" Antonio asked. "He claimed he was coming from basketball practice," Martinez said. "But he was being evasive and argumentative." Diego's head snapped up. "I wasn't being argumentative. I answered every question you asked. I told you exactly where I'd been and offered to show you my student ID." "Son," Antonio said gently, putting a hand on Diego's shoulder. "Let me handle this." He turned back to the officers. "Did you verify his story? Did you call the school or check his ID?" Johnson and Martinez looked at each other. "We were planning to do that after we brought him in," Johnson said. But he kept insisting his father was a police captain, which honestly sounded like a story. "Why would that sound like a story?" Antonio asked, his voice getting slightly colder. "Well, sir," Martinez said, "you know how it is. Everyone claims their relative is a cop when they get arrested. We hear it all the time." Antonio studied both officers carefully. They were probably good cops, he thought. They'd responded to a call, found someone who matched a description, and made an arrest. In another situation with different circumstances, he might have commended them for their thoroughness. But this wasn't another situation. This was his son, sitting in a holding room, charged with crimes he obviously didn't commit. "Officers," Antonio said calmly, "I need you to tell me exactly what evidence you have that my son committed a break-in." "He was in the area," Johnson said. "He matched the description, and he was acting suspicious." "How was he acting suspicious?" "He kept asking questions instead of just cooperating," Martinez replied. Antonio felt his jaw tighten. "Asking questions is suspicious behavior?" "Well, no, sir, but..." "And what exactly did he match in the description? Dark clothing and a backpack?" "Yes, sir." Antonio looked at Diego, then back at the officers. "Officers, do you realize how many teenagers in this city wear dark clothing and carry backpacks? Especially students walking home from school?" The room fell silent. Antonio could see the officers beginning to understand the weakness of their case. "Sir," Johnson said finally, "we were just following protocol. We responded to a call, Found someone who matched the description and made an arrest. Did you attempt to verify his identity before arresting him? We plan to do that at the station. Did you call the school to verify his story about basketball practice? No, sir. Did you check his student ID when he offered to show it to you? Not immediately, no, sir. Antonio nodded slowly. Officers, I want you to understand something. My son has never been arrested. He's never been in trouble. He's an honor student and a varsity athlete. He volunteers at the community center on weekends. The idea that he would break into someone's house is absurd to anyone who knows him. With respect, sir, Martinez said, we didn't know any of that when we made the arrest. But you could have found it out very easily, Antonio replied. One phone call to the school, one look at his student ID, one conversation with any of the neighbors who tried to vouch for him. Diego spoke up quietly. Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez, and Mrs. Patterson both tried to tell them I lived in the neighborhood, but they threatened to arrest them too. Antonio's expression darkened. You threatened to arrest witnesses who were trying to provide character testimony. They were interfering with our investigation, Johnson said defensively. They were trying to prevent you from making a mistake, Antonio corrected. And apparently they were right. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Antonio knew he was at a crossroads. How he handled this moment would set the tone for everything that came after. He could explode in anger, which would accomplish nothing except making him feel better. He could use his new position as chief to intimidate these officers into submission, or he could try to turn this into a teaching moment. He chose the third option. Officers, Antonio said, sitting down across from them. I want you to help me understand something. What was your primary goal tonight when you responded to that break-in call? To catch the perpetrator, Johnson answered. Right. To catch the person who actually committed the crime. Now, looking back on tonight's events, do you think you accomplished that goal? Both officers were quiet. While you were spending time arresting my son, taking him to the station, and processing paperwork, where was the real perpetrator? Probably getting away, Martinez admitted quietly. Exactly. And now, because this arrest was based on such thin evidence, it's likely that the real criminal will never be caught. The victim of the break-in won't get justice, and the person responsible is free to potentially commit more crimes. Antonio leaned forward. I'm not telling you this to embarrass you or to get you in trouble. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand how important it is to gather evidence before making arrests, especially when you're dealing with juveniles. He gestured toward Diego. Look at my son. Really look at him. Does he look like someone who just committed a burglary? His gym clothes are still damp with sweat from basketball practice. His backpack is full of school books and homework. His hands are clean. He has no stolen property on him. And multiple witnesses tried to tell you he was a neighborhood kid with no history of trouble. Johnson and Martinez both looked uncomfortable, but Antonio could see they were listening. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with me, Antonio continued. If my son had been a different color, or if he'd been wearing different clothes, or if he'd lived in a different neighborhood, would you have approached this situation the same way? The question hung in the air like smoke. Antonio watched both officers carefully, looking for any sign of understanding or self-reflection. Finally, Martinez spoke. Captain, I think maybe we could have handled things differently. It was a small admission, but it was a start. Officers, Antonio said, I'm going to be taking over as chief of police tomorrow, and one of my first priorities is going to be implementing new training protocols for exactly these kinds of situations. I hope I can count on both of you to be part of that process. Both officers nodded, though they still looked shaken. Now, Antonio said, standing up, I think it's time to release my son and drop all charges. Don't you agree? Yes, sir, Johnson said immediately. As the paperwork was being processed, Antonio sat with Diego in the holding room. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Diego broke the silence. Dad, was that really you on the news tonight? Did you really get promoted to chief? Antonio smiled sadly. Yes, it was. And yes, I did. Congratulations, Diego said, but his voice was flat. Diego, I want you to know that this experience, as terrible as it was, is going to help me be a better chief. What happened to you tonight should never happen to any kid in this city. Diego nodded, but Antonio could see the hurt in his eyes. The trust and innocence that had been damaged tonight wouldn't be easily repaired. As they finally walked out of the police station together, Antonio realized that his real work as chief was just beginning. And it would start with making sure that what happened to Diego would never happen to another family again. The next morning, Antonio woke up to his phone buzzing constantly. Text messages, missed calls, and news alerts filled his screen. Somewhere between the police station and home the night before, word had gotten out about Diego's arrest. By dawn, the story was everywhere. New police chief's son arrested hours after promotion, read the headline on Channel 7's website. The local newspaper had gone with chief's first test, his own family. Social media was exploding with videos that neighbors had taken, showing Diego in handcuffs while Antonio was probably still celebrating his promotion across town. Rosa sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, scrolling through news articles with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. "They're calling it everything from ironic to proof that the system is broken." Diego was unusually quiet as he ate his breakfast. The confident, happy teenager who had left for basketball practice yesterday seemed smaller today, more withdrawn. He kept glancing at his phone, where his friends were sending him links to news stories and social media posts about what had happened. "Dad," Luna said, looking up from her own phone, "my friends are asking if Diego is really going to be famous now." "This isn't the kind of famous anyone wants to be," Antonio replied grimly. He'd been awake most of the night, thinking about how to handle the situation. His first instinct as a father was to protect his family's privacy and try to make the story go away. But his responsibilities as the new chief of police were pulling him in a different direction. This incident had become a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America, and how he responded would set the tone for his entire tenure. Antonio's phone rang. It was Mayor Chen. "Chief Vasquez, I hope you and your family are doing okay this morning." "We're managing. Thank you. I've been getting calls all morning from reporters, community activists, and city council members. Everyone wants to know how you're going to handle this situation." Antonio looked across the kitchen at Diego, who was pretending not to listen to the conversation. "I'm still figuring that out. Mayor, this is obviously a very personal situation for my family. I understand that, but it's also become a very public situation. The whole city is watching to see how the new chief of police handles his first crisis, and unfortunately that crisis involves his own son. What are you suggesting?" "I think you need to address this head-on. Hold a press conference. Talk about what happened. Show the city that you're committed to accountability, even when it involves officers from your own department." Antonio knew she was right, but the thought of putting his family through more public scrutiny made his stomach churn. "I'll need to talk to my family first." "Of course. But Chief, I'd recommend doing it soon. The longer this story sits out there without a response from you, the worse it's going to get." After ending the call, Antonio sat down with Rosa and the kids to discuss their options. "I don't want to go through this again," Diego said immediately. "I don't want to be on TV or in newspapers talking about what happened. I just want it to go away." "I understand that," Antonio said gently, "but I don't think ignoring it is going to make it disappear. People are going to keep talking about it whether we participate or not. At least this way we can control our own narrative." Rosa reached across the table and took Diego's hand. "What do you think would help other kids who might go through the same thing?" It was a smart question. Diego had always been motivated by helping others. Even as a little kid, he'd been the one to stand up for classmates who were being picked on. "I guess," Diego said slowly, "if telling my story could prevent this from happening to someone else, then maybe it would be worth it." "You don't have to decide right now," Antonio assured him, "but I do think we need to address this publicly somehow." Later that morning, Antonio drove to police headquarters for his first day as chief. The building looked the same as it had the day before, but everything felt different. Officers who would normally greet him with casual nods and jokes now looked uncertain about how to approach him. Everyone had heard about Diego, and everyone was wondering how the new chief would handle it. Sergeant Williams met Antonio at the elevator. "Chief, the media is already gathering outside, and you've got about a dozen meeting requests from community groups. Set up meetings with anyone who wants to talk," Antonio said. "I'm not hiding from this." His first stop was to review the arrest report from the night before. Reading the official documentation of Diego's detention was somehow worse than living through it. The dry bureaucratic language made the whole incident sound routine and justified. There was no mention of the neighbors who had vouched for Diego, no record of his willingness to provide identification, no acknowledgement that the evidence was circumstantial at best. Antonio called Officers Johnson and Martinez into his office. "I've read your report," he began, "and I want to give you both a chance to tell me if there's anything you'd like to add or clarify." Both officers looked uncomfortable. Johnson spoke first. "Chief, after thinking about it overnight, I realize we may be moved too fast on the arrest. We should have investigated more before taking the kid into custody." "What would you do differently if you could do it over?" Antonio asked. "I'd check his ID first," Martinez said. "I'd call the school to verify his story. I'd listen to the neighbors instead of threatening them. And I'd remember that matching a vague description isn't the same as having probable cause," Johnson added. Antonio nodded. These were good officers who had made mistakes. The question was how to turn those mistakes into learning opportunities. "I'm placing both of you on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation," Antonio announced. "This isn't a punishment. It's standard procedure for any incident involving the arrest of a minor without sufficient cause. We understand." "Chief, when you come back," Antonio continued, "you'll both be participating in our new de-escalation and community policing training. And I'd like you to consider sharing your experience with other officers so they can learn from what happened." Over the next week, Antonio found himself in a constant balancing act. Community activists demanded that he fire the officers involved. The police union argued that the officers had followed proper procedure and shouldn't be disciplined. The media wanted daily updates on the investigation, and his family just wanted their lives to return to normal. The breakthrough came when Diego approached Antonio with an idea. "Dad, what if I talked to the officers who arrested me?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we all sat down together and talked about what happened? Not for the media or for a lawsuit or anything like that, just to understand each other." It was a mature suggestion that impressed Antonio. "Are you sure you want to do that?" "I think it might help, for them and for me." The meeting took place in a small conference room at headquarters. Diego sat across from Officers Johnson and Martinez, with Antonio and a department mediator present. For the first few minutes, everyone was awkward and formal. Then Diego started talking. "I know you were just doing your job," he said. "And I know that when you got that call about a break-in, you wanted to catch the person who did it. I get that. But I want you to understand what it felt like from my side." He described the fear of being handcuffed for the first time, the embarrassment of having his neighbors see him arrested, the frustration of not being believed when he told the truth. "I kept thinking," Diego said, "that if you would just listen to me for 2 minutes, we could clear this whole thing up. But it felt like you had already decided I was guilty." Officer Martinez spoke up. "Diego, I want to apologize to you. You're right. We should have listened better. We should have investigated before making the arrest. And I want to thank you for being respectful even when we weren't listening," Johnson added. "A lot of people would have gotten angry or tried to run. The fact that you stayed calm probably prevented the situation from getting a lot worse." The conversation continued for over an hour. Both officers shared their perspective on the pressures they felt to make arrests and solve crimes quickly. Diego talked about how the experience had changed his relationship with police and made him more aware of how other young people in his community might feel. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't friendship, but it was understanding. 3 months later, Antonio stood in front of a packed auditorium in the Riverside Community Center. It was the same neighborhood where Diego had been arrested, and many of the people in the audience were the same neighbors who had witnessed that night. 6 months ago, Antonio began, I was promoted to chief of police with a mandate to improve relations between our department and the communities we serve. I had plans and programs and policies I wanted to implement. Then on my first day, my own son became a victim of the very problems I was supposed to solve. He looked out at the audience, which included community activists, police officers, city officials, and regular citizens. I could have used my position to cover up what happened. I could have transferred the officers involved and hoped the story would go away. Instead, I want to tell you about what we've learned and how we're using this experience to change the way our department operates. Antonio outlined the new policies the department had implemented. Mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, revised protocols for juvenile encounters, a civilian oversight board with real authority, and regular community forums where citizens could speak directly with police leadership. We've also created a new position in the department, Antonio continued. Community liaison for youth relations. This person will work directly with schools, youth organizations, and community groups to build positive relationships between young people and police officers. He paused and looked toward the back of the auditorium. I'm proud to announce that our first youth relations liaison will be my son, Diego. The audience turned as Diego walked to the front of the room. He looked nervous but determined as he took the microphone. 3 months ago, I was arrested for walking home from basketball practice, Diego said. It was the worst experience of my life. But it also taught me something important. Change doesn't happen automatically. It happens when people who have been hurt decide to work for something better. He talked about the mentorship program he'd been developing, pairing police officers with high school students for community service projects. He described the workshops he'd been conducting at schools, teaching young people about their rights and how to interact safely with law enforcement. I'm not doing this because I think all police officers are bad, Diego explained. The officers who arrested me are good people who made mistakes. I'm doing this because I think all young people deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods. When the presentation ended, the audience erupted in applause. Antonio watched his son shake hands with community leaders, police officers, and the same neighbors who had tried to help him that night in March. Later, as they walked home together through the same streets where Diego had been arrested, Antonio reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Are you proud of what we've accomplished? Diego asked. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, Antonio replied. You took the worst night of your life and turned it into something that's going to help other people. That takes real courage. They passed the spot where Diego had been handcuffed. Someone had painted a small mural on the wall nearby, showing police officers and community members working together to plant a garden. Dad, Diego said, do you think what happened to me was worth it? I mean, if it leads to changes that help other kids? Antonio considered the question carefully. I would never want you to go through that experience again. But I'm amazed by how you've chosen to respond to it. You've shown that even when the system fails, people can still choose to make it better. As they reached their apartment building, Mrs. Patterson waved from her porch. Diego, she called out, I saw you on the news tonight. Your grandmother would be so proud of the young man you've become. Diego smiled and waved back. Then he turned to his father. You know what the best part is? Diego said. I'm not afraid to walk home anymore. Antonio put his arm around his son's shoulder as they climbed the steps to their front door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build trust and create change. But tonight they were just a father and son, walking safely home through their neighborhood, knowing that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that help others avoid the battles you had to fight yourself.